The year 1995 was not only responsible for Nintendo's most embarrassing console, but Sega's as well. Enter the Sega Saturn. There are many factors that go into the failure of this console. Sadly, it's actually a pretty remarkable piece of hardware that to this day programmers don't truly understand how to utilize, and obviously never will now. What made the Saturn different, say, from the Sony PlayStation? Well, for one, it ran a dual CPU and had 8 processors. The first CPU chip was added in 1992 when Sega began development on the product. This chip was the same that you'd find in a Sega Model 1 arcade machine, which was very popular for its time. The second chip was only added after Sega had heard what the Sony PlayStation was actually capable of doing, so obviously it wasn't that good and the whole process of it was rushed. Programmers grew increasingly frustrated with trying to program games for a system that was too difficult to program for. This would lead to programmers deciding to take their project to Sony, which was simpler to program for and could render 3D graphics much better than the Sega Saturn. So if that alone wasn't enough for the PlayStation to outsell the Saturn, Sega felt it was necessary to create an even bigger hole for themselves. During the initial launch of the Saturn in Japan, it seemed that the console would do just fine and it sold 200,000 units on the first day. A huge reason for this was the release of Virtua Fighter, one of Sega's mainstream arcade games. If I recall correctly, it was the first fighting game to feature fully 3D rendered fighters. It looks silly now after you look at the games like Tekken and the Injustice series, but it was a groundbreaking game for its time. Virtua Fighter was basically the only game one could get at launch, and for a moment it had seemed that it was all the Sega Saturn needed. Then comes in the 32X, and oh god, that's a topic for another day. I currently don't own one, but when I get one, trust me, I'll make a video on it. The American market was still waiting for the Saturn, and rather than keeping fans waiting, Sega released an add-on hardware for the Sega Genesis called the 32X, and it was stupid. Long story short, it turned Sega fans off from getting more Sega products, and it gave a reason to think about getting a PlayStation instead. Sega of Japan was feeling the heat once the PlayStation launched in Japan in 1994. And ultimately forced Sega of America's CEO, Tom Kalinske, I think that's how you say that by the way, to launch the product 4 months before the proposed date of September 2, 1995, which would have been dubbed Saturn Day. It sounds cheesy now, but trust me, it would have been a great way to promote a product from many retailers. Sega would eventually go on to announce a surprise launch at E3 and claim that 30,000 units had already been shipped to certain retailers. However, this pissed off a lot of other retailers, you know, like Best Buy and Walmart. I actually heard KB Toys refused to even shelve the product. And to make it worse, the Saturn was launched at $399. Are you fucking kidding me? People don't even pay that kind of money for consoles now. Maybe committed gamers, but gaming back then was not that serious. Look at Shaq Fu. Sony's president Steve Race would take the stage, simply saying the words, $299. Obviously, this was a reference to Sega's silly launch price, considering its lack of third-party games. This also led to the console not selling well in Europe simply because retailers had no time to promote. When you spent $50 million on advertisements and only sold 9.4 million units, the numbers aren't going to add up. And it wasn't long until Sony would take over the market share. Ultimately, the nail in the coffin would be the launch of the Nintendo 64, which would also outsell the Saturn rather quickly considering how much later it was introduced to the American market. There's the obvious factors on why the system also failed. Say the lack of a legitimate Sonic game. Sonic Extreme was in the works, but once the system started failing, they would save the project, which would ultimately become Sonic Adventure. So was it really a bad console? No. It was a great console. It's unfortunate that buying games for this console is expensive because Saturns are relatively affordable today. And if you have a TV that runs S-Video, it looks fantastic, even on a modern display. There are quite frankly way too many fun games to play on the Saturn, and I recommend if you're into one-on-one fighters, shoot-em-ups, and racing games, this is the console for you. I also hear it's great for RPG games, but I haven't played any yet, so for now, here are some games that I highly recommend trying out for yourself.